Hey all, in this lesson we're going to be learning about metering compensation and the histogram. Metering compensation is something that you're going to be doing from within your camera, so this is a hands-on lesson for you to get your cameras out. Manuals are for reading. Most DSL cameras can display a histogram, and many point-and-shoot cameras have some capability for displaying a histogram. So it's time to dig out that manual and to read it and to learn about your camera and its capabilities. In the videos that I'll be sharing here in this lesson, I'll be sharing my DSLR and my point-and-shoot cameras, but they're not going to be exactly like your camera. And so what your job to do is to learn about your specific camera and to look for these things that I share with you in this lesson on your own camera. Look for an option to view the histogram in the viewer while composing the shot, or an option to view the histogram when viewing the taken photo. So you're going to be looking for two things. You're going to be looking for an ability to see the histogram while you're composing the shot before you've taken it, and you're also going to be looking for an option to see the histogram after you've taken the photo and you play the photo back on the screen on the back of your camera. There are two types of histograms. The histogram on the left is a histogram for brightness values. Sometimes it's called luminous histogram, sometimes it's called brightness histogram. And when you're looking at it on your camera, it's actually going to have a little white mountain most often. In Photoshop and Photoshop Elements, when we're looking at the histogram, it's got a black mountain. It's just reversed. I don't know why they've done that. But the other histogram that you may find on DSLR cameras is the red, green, and blue histogram. The RGB histogram, which is a graph of the brightness in the color channels, and we're not going to be discussing this one in this lesson. We're going to stick with the basic histogram, and so when I say histogram, I'm going to be referring to the luminous histogram or the brightness histogram. I'm not going to say luminous and brightness all the time to differentiate between the two. Just know that in this lesson, when I say histogram, we're only talking about the luminous or the brightness one. Ideal exposure. We got a little taste of what exposure is in a previous lesson, and we know exposure is all about light. But what is the ideal exposure? And that is what this lesson is going to be more about. There is no perfectly exposed photo. There may be one random one somewhere out there, but in general, the photos that you take, there's going to be no perfectly exposed photo. So don't try to get a perfectly exposed photo, because there is no such thing. The histogram in a good exposed photo has a mountain in the center. It is bell-shaped, and here's a bell icon, and if you look at the top of the icon and see where it starts out a little sloped on the left and rises to the center, and then it comes out down and has a slope on the right. Of course, this bell is not symmetrical, but if it were, imagine it perfectly symmetrical, that would be a perfectly exposed photo if you had a bell-shaped histogram like that, where it reached from the right to the left on the histogram, sloped slowly on the edges, and had a mountain in the middle. Exposure is subjective. Often resources point to one correct exposure, and it can be so intimidating to have this mindset when learning about photography. I think a lot of the resources and other lessons out there that people want to tell you, get that correct exposure, and you become so intimidated that because you want to be right. There is no right and no wrong. It is all subjective. So shake that right out of your head. There is no single exposure that is perfectly right. Photography, like any other art form, is open to creative interpretation, and exposure lies in the eyes of the beholder. I am sure for those that are scrapbookers that are taking this with us, you know that there are some layouts that you absolutely love that you see other people do, and then other layouts you don't particularly care for that style of layout. That's what art is. Art is open to interpretation, and the creativeness is subjective to the eyes of the beholder, and photography is an art. You often will hear the word creative modes. I hear this a lot, and beginning to realize and understand more why they call them creative modes. The term is often used to represent the manual aperture priority and shutter priority modes on the cameras. Now, these three modes are only in DSLR, but you have a program mode in most point and shoots also, and that can be used creatively, as well as the preset modes can be used creatively. Because exposure is subjective and creativity is open to the photographer, this is a creative art. Are you creative with your photography? I do hope that this class is going to help you learn to appreciate the art of creativity every time you pick up your camera. And I'm not going to be telling you there's right or wrong with any of your photographs. If you like them, that's what counts. Let's consider the histogram and learn a little bit more about the histogram. The histogram is a graph of colors. This graph on the left starts with black pixels, and if you recall in Photoshop Elements, the color picker, and if you click, you see this has got a dot on the B for brightness, so that this slider here is the brightness slider. You're going to see that the RGB for this is 0. So black is 0. And this graph here you can imagine as the same graph as on your histogram. Only you have to kind of turn it 90 degrees. One edge is going to be black, and the other edge is going to be white on the right. This would be your left and this would be your right, and black is 0. Now white 255 is going to be on the right, so you see I've changed the brightness to 100%, and you can see the RGB now is 255, and there it is on the other side. Learning about the numbers, the 255 and the 0 and such, also helps you translate from your camera and your photos into your program when we get to the program lessons a little bit later. Then there's shades of gray in the middle, and so here is a 50% gray. You're going to see right here 50% on brightness, and it makes it a RGB of 128. And so there is a wide range of pixels representing every pixel from 0 to 255 on the histogram. The number of pixels of any given shade of gray is represented by a graph line upwards. And so here's our histogram. Of course, there's no perfect photo with a perfect exposure, and this one doesn't do too bad. You can see it goes up and it slopes down. It's a pretty good example. What's wrong with this one is that it doesn't reach all the way to the left and all the way to the right, so it is not perfect. But you can see the jagged edges here. Obviously, in the photo that I used to get this histogram, there's no zero blacks, total blacks in this photo, and nothing close to that end, because there's no upward lines on the graph. And the same thing with the whites. There's no totally white on this image, but somewhere in here, let's say right here is that 128 we were looking at, and if we go up, this many pixels are represented by that shade of gray. And so each one of these going up represents that shade of gray on your histogram. Now, when we get into the lesson after this, I will show you how to read exactly how many pixels are on each of those lines, but that's going to be the next lesson. This lesson we're actually focusing on your hands on camera, but you need to learn about these things before we look at the cameras. Tone zones. I'm sure when you read tutorials you always hear about tones, and this is going to maybe help you understand tones a little bit better. Another way to consider the histogram is from a dark tones zone on the left, which is going to be your shadows, to a mid-tone zone in the middle of your histogram, to light tone zones, which are the highlights in your photos. So the left side of your histogram is going to represent the shadows. So in this histogram that we previously reviewed, we don't have a whole lot of shadows, and we're also lacking in the highlights. The highlights would be where the sun blows it out. Instant insight. That's what's so great about most of the newer digital cameras. Consider a camera histogram as instant insight. It tells you what is about to happen before it happens. Now, when you have film photography, you don't have this option, and so in our digital age, digital photographs, you have this benefit. So find it in your camera. Consider a software histogram, such as in our Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, as an instant fix. It tells you what has already happened and allows you to manage the adjustments. Good exposure. Now I'm using the word good because there's no single correct exposure. Don't like it when tutorials refer to correct or perfect exposures, because there is no one single correct exposure. So you'll hear me referring to it as good exposure as opposed to bad exposure. Good exposure is the one exposure that creates a digital file with the most information within the pixels. Digital photography, as opposed to film photography, should be viewed from a different perspective. Good exposure for film photographer is not the same thing as good exposure for digital photography. The reason being is that an image with the most information within the pixels has the most options available in post-processing. So the difference is, with digital photography, we can post-process. We can fix these photos in Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. That is not possible with film photography. Sure it is if you scan the photo in, but we all know that you lose a lot when you're scanning a photo in. But this is the reason why you want to get the most information on the pixels. And then later fix it. So if you have missing information in your pixels, then you have no information to work with. And we're going to be seeing a little bit of that at the end of this lesson right here in this presentation. But just remember, you want to get the most information. It doesn't matter if when you bring it into your computer it doesn't look right. If that information in the pixels is not there, you're not going to be able to fix it as well as if all the information was there. A RAW file format contains more information than a JPEG file, which is a compelling consideration. So if you're going for more information and you are a professional photographer, consider looking at your manual and finding out where that RAW file is. Of course, then you're going to have to learn how to post-process RAW files. But for these lessons, I'm going to be sticking with JPEGs. Underexposure. Now we're going to learn the differences between underexposure and overexposure. This image that I have here is an underexposed photo. It's not exposed to the light enough, so the photo will be dark. The majority of the photos are underexposed. The histogram has the graph with most of the white or black, depending on what it is, on the left. As you can see here in this image, all of the histogram is on the left because this is a drastically underexposed photo. And in Photoshop, you're going to move the little white marker all the way over to the left edge of the mountain, and we're going to review that in the next lesson after our hands-on lesson here. Snow photos are always underexposed unless of course you make changes with your metering compensation. The camera detects sun on the snow and adjusts the exposure down, and we'll be talking about that in another lesson in more detail. Here's an overexposed photo. It's exposed too much to the light, so the photo is very light. It's very bright. And the histogram, you can see the graph on this is all the way to the right because it is overexposed. And when we get into Photoshop in the next lesson on fixing photos, you'll be moving the black marker to the edge of the mountain. Good exposure, not correct, but good exposure. What is an example of good exposure? We have under and overexposure, but what is an example of good exposure? What should that histogram look like for a good exposed photo? The mountain is in the center. We already talked about that, and you can see that in this image. The mountain is in the center. But also we talk about high dynamic range, and that is every pixel is represented from the left to the right. High contrast in an image results in high dynamic range. If you've taken some of the other lessons at Hummy's World, and in particular the photos on having a brain fart on design principles for your photos, on the principles and focal point, you'll hear me talking about a lot about focal point. You'll know one of the principles is on contrast, and high contrast is where you have a lot of light maybe in the background and a lot of dark in your photo. Or the opposite, maybe your matte is dark and your photo is light. So contrast is having a wide range from light to dark or dark to light. And every pixel is represented on the graph from left to right. Here is a better example of a high contrast photo. You can see here on the left that we do have pixels on the left, on the black, on the 0, 0, and we do have pixels on the right, on the white 255. And so this would be a good exposed with a high dynamic range. But low contrast, where there's either a whole lot of white or not as much white, maybe more dark than white, that has a low dynamic range. It does not cover pixels from left to right. Here is an example of that. You see on the left of this histogram there are no pixels covered on the dark area of this one. This would be a low contrast. Gaps indicate a low contrast and dynamic range. In this one you're going to see gaps. I had trouble finding an example, a good example of gaps in my photos that I was going through on my computer. But here you can see there's a big slump down here in the middle. This would be like considered in a gap where there's almost no pixels in this area. We have a lot of dark pixels over here and we have some light pixels over here, but in the middle there is not. Now this doesn't mean that it's not a correctly exposured image. It just means that it's a low dynamic range, and so the pixels in here aren't going to have much information. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe that is the mood that you're going for in this image, where you have, you know, maybe a silhouette on a white background and there isn't many other colors, and maybe that's what you're going for. So that doesn't mean it's wrong. This is just for your information, for you to understand and know what to look for in case it's not what you're going for. Clipped highlights and shadows. Now this is something in the newer cameras, and you're going to see this in the video in just a little bit, is something that the DSLRs are really good at having a setting so you can see those clipped highlights, and it will make a lot more sense. But clipping highlights and clipped shadows can be imagined as pixels that should be a shade of gray, but because of the camera settings are instead white or black and stacked up on either end of the histogram. Now that was a whole lot of words. Let me go over that a little bit. Let's say you have clipped the highlights. If on the right side of your histogram you have a high section of the graph that suddenly goes up, that is probably an indication of some clipped highlights. In other words, you have overexposed it so much that maybe that yellow in the sign is showing, and you'll see this in my video. This is where I'm getting my example, where the yellow in a sign is supposed to be yellow, but you've overexposed it so much that it's actually white. And the colors are not as they're supposed to be. If you overexpose it more, it might bring in more areas and turn them into white instead of the color that they are supposed to be. Same thing on the other end for shadows. If you have a straight line on the left edge, it usually indicates that you've clipped some shadows. In other words, referencing back to the beginning of the other part of this lesson, when I said that the best exposure, the good exposure, is the one with the most information. If you have clipped some of that information, you're never ever going to get it back. So if you have clipped off some of the colors in that yellow and made them white, you're never going to be able to get that information back. If you have changed the exposure so you'll get it and it's not quite the right color, but you have that information, you can always edit that and change that in post-processing in many different ways. So a highlight detail or a shadow detail has been lost, and it's just not good exposure. This is something you really want to watch out for. Clipped highlights indicate an overexposure and clipped shadows indicate an underexposure. Some cameras have a highlight alert which flashes to tell you what parts of an image have been clipped. My camera does that. You're going to see this in the upcoming video, but you'll see also in this video that you have to set that as enabled in the menu, because it doesn't come as a default. Sometimes these areas of alert are natural highlights though, and are nothing to be concerned about. Just because you see that flashing on your screen on your camera as an alert, it doesn't mean it's wrong. If you are photographing water and it's a bright day and the sun is making a highlight on the top of the flows of the river, of the water, whatever water fountain, river, whatever kind of water you're looking at, if it's making a highlight, then it should be there. That's a natural highlight that should be there. What you need to learn to look for are things that are not natural highlights that are being clipped. And it's good to look at the back of your screen and then closely look at what you're photographing and go back and forth and look to see what is being shared on the highlight alert, and decide whether that's a natural highlight or whether that's one that's actually being clipped and you need to fix your exposure. So here is an example of clipped shadows. You can see on the left hand side it is just spiked all the way up there to the top. There's probably some clipping going on here. This would be an example of something you need to be pay attention to as a possible fix for your photographs. If you see something that looks like this, where that 0 on the histogram is all the way up to the top, then you might be missing information. And here is an example of the highlights being clipped. You can see on the right edge it goes all the way to the top. So those highlights may be clipped in this image right here. So that would be something you want to pay attention to when looking at those histograms. So now I've taken a video of my cameras in action out in my garden, and we're going to watch the video sharing exposure compensation in a DSLR camera. Hi, I'm Hummy from Hummy's World, and we are outside in the garden for our first hands-on camera lesson. I have here my Canon 40D. It is a DSLR, and next we will be filming my Olympus Tough, and it is a point and shoot. And so these lessons should be applicable to all types of cameras, and I hope that you are able to apply these to your camera. I have here the menu button on my DSLR, and I need to show you a few things for this in order to get the live view in my camera to show. And so first I'm going to go over to this fourth blue one, and you need to get out your manual and determine where these things are on your camera, if they are available on your camera. But here is the highlight alert, and I simply clicked to enable it. Blue means that's what's chosen, so that is enabled, and I will show you what that is here in a little bit. Next, we want to go down to this icon over here in my menu, and you'll see it says Live View Function Settings, and in here I just have it enabled also. Click Menu to return, and then what also is important is to go all the way over to this orange one, and down here Operation Others, you scroll through them, and the option number 7 is for live view exposure simulation. That is also important to be enabled. You see it's in blue because I've already enabled it. And so that's where these settings are in the menu to enable them on my Canon 40D. Get out your manual if you have a DSLR. Google online, see where these settings are to see if you can do these things with your camera. Okay, I'm going to exit out of the menu. To start the live view on my Canon, I have to make sure I'm not just on the on, but I'm also all the way up above the on, the second on button. Otherwise this does not work properly. It's not just the live view, but the program mode that I'm going to be showing you also will not work if you are not in that setting. So I'm going to click now this button, and you'll hear the mirror moving inside, and you're going to see, let me line this up here a little bit. I'm going to compose my shot, and I've got some flowers here in my garden, but you can see on my live view the histogram. And of course I'm going to be talking more about the histogram in other parts of this lesson. This is just to show you how to do these things right in the camera. And so the live view is actually a live view of my histogram. And if I hold down the shutter button, I can, are you getting this up here? Okay. I can scroll this wheel, and oops, I forgot to show you. I am on program mode. This green one is dummy mode. This is when the camera does all the work. And this P for program mode is what you're going to want to start in. That is like taking the training wheels off. Or maybe it's with training wheels, and these up here more advanced are taking your training wheels off. So the program mode does most of the math for you, just like the dummy mode, only it allows you to do a few other things, and so that's important. We're going to be working in the program mode in both the cameras. Okay, I'm going to kind of recompose my shot, and you can see as I move it around, the histogram is moving, and we are, what, about dusk right now? Whoops. It only stays on for so long, that live mode. We are at about dusk, so there's not a whole lot of light coming into play right now, and you can see it's not a bad histogram. And if I hold down the shutter button, you're going to see now it shows me my shutter speed and my aperture right here. And if I want to just move this to get different shutter speed and aperture combinations that is good for this setting, I can do that. So this is doing all the calculation for me. Over here is the ISO. And of course, we're going to talk more about those later. This lesson is focusing on the histogram in your camera. But now I'm also able to move this exposure compensation. And this is the main focus of this lesson, because the exposure compensation directly lets in more light or stops more light from coming in. And so if you see I move my exposure compensation to +2, you can see that it moved all the way over on the histogram. And I can take that photo, and I'm not sure if that took it or not, because it looked like a really long exposure and it might have been too far. But now I'm going to push down the shutter button halfway again and move it back down maybe to 1. You can see that's kind of a perfect exposure. And then I can take that photo. Oh, there, it took it. The first one had too long exposure mode. Now I can push down the shutter button again part way and move it to 0 where there's no compensation, and take another photo and do the same thing once again. Here's -1, and here it won't let me go down any further because that's telling me that would be way too dark. Let's see. It's, oh, I'm turning the wrong thing, that's why. Oh, it is going down. It goes all the way down to 2. Let's try again. And take that at 2. You're going to see that that happened really fast. And let's see if we can't go back up and get this +2 again. You'll see when I change this changed to 3.5, now 4. This one now changed to 50. And now 60. So when I am changing the exposure compensation, it is actually changing the aperture and the shutter speed. And sometimes it might change the ISO. So let's go up here and see how long that shutter speed. Oh, that one took right away. Okay, so that's how you can do the live viewing of the histogram in some cameras. And I want to show you now on playback. I hit this one, and if I hit the info button, it rotates between different views of the photo that I have taken. This one shows me the photo, and you can see the clipping flashing in it, showing me where this image has been clipped, where the highlights have been blown out, where things are showing up as white when they might not need to be showing up as white. And this one you can see it's overexposed because this is the one where we had +2 compensation, and you can see it is overexposed because the histogram is all the way to the right. And if I hit it again, oops, wrong button. Let's get that image back up. Hit the info button. This one shows me the RGB as well as the luminance or the brightness, and it's still showing the clipping. And this one is a larger view to see where the clipping is, because sometimes it might be okay, like maybe a glare from the sun might be all white, and that might be okay. But in this case, especially around this planter that's supposed to be yellow and not white, it's really getting it clipped. Let's see if we can't view another image. This one is the one that was -2, and you can see it's not clipping any of the writing on the flower plant, just the sky up here, and that's okay. That would be natural. And this one is the -1. Same thing, it's not clipping any of this, just that up there, it's showing me. And this one is actually no exposure compensation, and it's actually doing okay too. And here on +1, it actually is much brighter, and there's not much clipping going on, so that might be the best setting right there. Of course, you would have to click on info again and look at the histogram. There's the histogram for that one. Looks just right, and this is the +1 compensation. The +2, you can see the histogram is too far over to the right. It is overexposed. Here's the -2. You can see it's drastically underexposed because that is to the left. And the -1 gets a little bit more centered, but it's still underexposed. And there is no exposure compensation, and it's not too bad, but the dynamic range is not so good because it doesn't reach all the way to the left and all the way to the right. Let's see, that +1, where'd it go? That one you can see is actually a better compensation because the dynamic range is better. It reaches less gaps from the left to the right, and so that would probably be the best setting. And so you need to go to your camera and find out if you can see a live histogram, or on your playback mode if you have a histogram. And we're going to show you that in the point and shoot next. Okay, so that was the video for my DSLR camera, and you'll notice I made some errors. Sometimes my brain says to turn one dial and it pushes another dial, or I'm supposed to click the shutter button and I click the live button or whatever, but I think that you were able to get a lot of information, hopefully, out of that video. And so now we're going to watch a video sharing exposure compensation settings in a point and shoot camera. Okay, here we are with let me see if I can turn this around, my Olympus Tough. It's a point and shoot, an underwater camera. And I'm going to turn it on here, and you're going to see that it is on the auto mode. Now, I don't have to do any menu settings as I did with my DSLR because these features are mostly enabled. And if I don't keep touching it, it goes away. It turns off. So if I click down and I change this to the program mode, that's where we are working right now. We are all looking for that program mode on our cameras. That's going to allow us to do a little bit more than the auto mode, which was the dummy mode. You're going to see when this comes up, it's great. It's got my graph for, it won't stay on if I don't keep moving the settings around. It's got that graph for the rule of thirds. And let me see if I can't zoom in a little bit, get kind of the same shot lined up that we had with the other one, with the other camera. And if you go on down on this camera right there, you're going to see exposure compensation. And what's great about this camera, I need to make sure that's lined up just right, is it kind of gives me a preview. I don't know why it keeps going off. Let's try this again. There we go. We got to zoom in and set that shot up again. And go down. And you're going to see right now a preview in the middle rather than a histogram.
And right here it's underexposed 0.3, and we can go all the way down to an underexposed of 2. And so I'm going to go like I did on the other camera and take these shots. There's underexposed. Oh, I turned it off rather than turning it on. Okay, rather than hitting the shutter button. Let's try again. I'm going to hit that and take that underexposed image, and I'm going to go back down and choose one that's -1 underexposed. Took that image, and when it comes back up, this is the thing, I got to scroll back down each time, but it does give you a preview in the middle rather than your histogram. And this is 0. It's not any exposure compensation at all. Take that photo, and I'm going to go down one more time and do the +1 exposed. Take that photo, and we're going to go back down and take it with, whoops, 2 overexposure. Now, that's how I do the exposure compensation in this camera. Now, I want to mention with the exposure compensation, if you get 3 different exposure compensations, one with it at 0, and then one underexposed and one overexposed, you can use HDR software to make HDR images, and we will be looking at that in another lesson. But I just wanted to bring that up. So now if I go to my playback mode, actually right down here is a histogram. I did not notice that. Let's go back down. You can't see it because this image is so overexposed. Here's something else that's important. You always want to make this go back to its default setting, because otherwise your next picture, if you're not paying attention, is going to be incorrect. And so we're going to accept that setting, and you can see actually the histogram down here and its setting. It's actually a live histogram, because if I go up, you can see it going to the right. This camera likes to save the batteries. And if I go down, you can kind of see it changing. But let's hit the playback mode, and you're going to see here I have hit the info button. This is the camera, the photo taken in normal playback mode, but I have info here, and if I push this button upwards, it's going to show me this image, and it's going to show me the histogram. Now there's no flashing to show me where it's been clipped or anything, but it does have a histogram on it, and it does show that this was +2 compensation. If I go to the next one, you can see that's a +1 compensation. You can see it has a really nice histogram. And this one is no compensation. You can see it's a little bit underexposed, and a little bit more underexposed at -1, and a little bit more underexposed at -2. And so this camera is just a point and shoot, and so this shows you what you can do with most any camera. Where was that image? That was +1. That was the best looking one right there. And so again, get out your manual and head outside and relax and enjoy yourself as we are in our garden, or you know, relax in your bed. Practice with your camera pointing up at the ceiling or at the window. It doesn't matter. Just get that camera out and learn where these settings are. These are some of the most important settings that you can be utilizing. And I look forward to seeing you around the forum.
I tell you, there was a lot of mosquitoes out there, and we had to spray ourselves down. And when we first started taking these videos, we had to stop and spray ourselves down, and then we ended up stopping again because the mosquitoes kept landing all over the cameras. So these cameras have actually been sprayed with mosquito repellent, protecting the lenses, of course. That was very, very nervous. In that first video, the DSLR, you might have seen my husband's reflection in part of it. If you were paying attention to it, I know I see it every time I watch the video again, and we're going to try to not make that mistake again, but I thank him for helping me to record these. So for this lesson, share in the forum your photos while playing with exposure compensation settings on your camera. There's a special gallery in our gallery labeled photography class. You can use the gallery to upload your layouts there. If you're familiar with Photoshop Elements and the scrapbooking, if you want to make just like a layout page to show 3 photos and caption each of them, you can do that. But share an underexposed, good exposed, and overexposed photo, and anything else that you've learned while you were out there playing with your camera. And for the next lesson, we will learn how to fix photos that are underexposed and overexposed, and maybe a few more things about the histogram. The next lesson is going to be hands-on in Photoshop or Photoshop Elements, as opposed to this lesson, which is get out there and use your camera. So I look forward to seeing you around the forums.